Okay, good morning everybody. Let's get started. How is everything going with deliverable 9? Any questions? No installation issues? Awesome. Okay. All right. So let's carry on discussing looking outward, talking about technology that is interacting with the physical world, and in some cases it's human aware in real time. We talked about ubiquitous computing and thinking about how to create it in such a way that it disappears into the background. If we continue on instrumenting our society and it becomes increasingly distracting, that's probably not the way to go. How do we create technology that disappears into the background? But despite the fact that it's ubiquitous and invisible, it is still supporting us in the things that we want to do. And to sort of concretize that abstract idea, in lecture 17, 18, and 19, we're looking at ubiquitous technology, which is scaffolding and supporting 3 different scientific projects. And these scientific projects are attempting to ask a scientific question that would be difficult or impossible to answer without ubiquitous technology. We'll finish our lecture today on social network inference. Of course, there are a lot of social networks out on the internet, and we can infer social dynamics among Twitter or Instagram by looking at messages going back and forth. But of course, there are tons of subtle social cues or subtle dynamics that are going on among a group that meets regularly face to face, builds up friendships and competitions and teams and so on. Very difficult to study groups, social groups, especially groups of humans in their natural habitat, and observe or infer from that social network what aspects of that social network influence how people behave in that social network. We'll finish that lecture shortly. We'll move on to activity tagging. So most of us carry around ubiquitous technology with us for most of our waking lives. These devices have sensors and they can infer something about the activities we're carrying out. And given those inferences, can they tell us something about our physical, social, or psychological well-being? We may finish that today. We may move on to the interesting Human Speechome project, which is yet a third project looking at how children acquire language. Okay, so back to social network inference. Just as a reminder, we were looking at this idea last time of instrumenting these 24 graduate students that it seems take classes in common. They tend to be in the same place at the same time on a regular basis throughout a 6-month period. We're going to use this microphone that is sitting near to their mouth and near to their ear to infer something about what conversations they're involved in, when are they speaking, and when are they hearing speech from someone else who's a member of this group. We ended last time by looking at this idea of mutual information. So using mutual information applied to just the volume levels of the microphone to infer who's speaking to whom and when and how often. Use that to distill all that volume, speaker volume information or microphone volume information down into a social network where the nodes are the graduate students and the weighted edges are the number of inferred conversations that those graduate students had. And then given that social network, can we then ask questions about where they sit in that social network, who they're speaking to, and whether and how that influences the way that they speak to other members of the group. There are important privacy issues with this particular experiment, so we're throwing away what the grad students said, and we're just inferring 4 features of prosody, or the way in which they speak. How fast, how high or low, how long do they hold the floor before ceding it to someone else, and how many times do they alternate speakers in a given conversation. Okay. We ended last time by looking at some correlations, or more particularly anti-correlations. We started by computing Dij, which is the difference, if any, in the way that I speaks to J compared to the way that I speaks to everyone except J. If D is 0, then the way that I speaks to J is exactly equal to the average way that I speaks to everyone else. And increasingly positive values of D indicate that I is increasingly changing the rate or pitch or turn length that they engage in with J compared to the mean value of how they do so with everyone other than J, right? That's D. Then we can compare D against other things like how close are I and J? And by close, we mean how often did they engage in conversations? And as we saw last time, there's an anti-correlation between D and C. When D goes down and approaches 0, they're speaking less, then CI goes up, which is the fraction of time that they speak with that person. So people that they speak with often, that's closer to the mean of how they speak in general to everyone else. But when they're speaking to someone they speak to rarely, so C is low, then D is high. They change their rate, their pitch, their turn length, and our probability here says probably not turn frequency. So far, so good? So using this technology, the raw measurements from this ubiquitous technology, and then doing a little bit of math here, we have marshaled, or the investigators have marshaled some evidence for a hypothesis that was difficult or impossible to measure among human groups in the wild. Of course, we can invite them into a laboratory and ask them to do some collaborative task, but that's somewhat artificial, right? How do grad students tend to behave when they're talking to their friends throughout a semester? Okay, let's take the same data and we're going to recompute it in a different way to tackle a different hypothesis. If you just pay attention to the top of the slide for a moment. Do people change their way of speaking when they speak to quote unquote well-connected people? So now not their friends, but people that have a prominent position in the social network. So we're going to keep D the same. We're going to ask, does I change the way they speak when they speak to J compared to everyone else? And we're going to compare D against C sub J now, which is the centrality of grad student J in this group of 24 graduate students. So what does centrality mean here? Or what is it representing? Going back to the actual behavior of the grad students. If we have 24 of them and this person has a high C, what does it mean?
Is he connected to a lot of people?
He or she is connected to a lot of the other graduate students, right, according to the social network, but can we be more specific than that? Not just connected with lots of edges to others. Remember that we have weighted edges in this social network. So what does centrality mean here?
Lots of exchanges between those people?
Lots of exchanges, right? So they engage, this particularly central J engages in lots of conversations with lots of the other graduate students, right? Okay. That's what C represents. In this case, we find that there's the investigators found, there's a positive correlation for some of these 4 features of prosody. High C means high D, low C means low D. Again, if we pay attention to the p-values down here, just as a reminder, the p-values are probabilities that detected correlation is actually not there. And at least in the case of rate of speech, pitch, P is exceedingly low, which means this positive correlation is probably true. We can probably trust the fact that when C goes up, D goes up, and vice versa for rate and pitch, but not for turn length and turn frequency. For most mathematicians, the p-value is sufficiently high here that I wouldn't trust this positive correlation. Okay. What's the interpretation of that? What does it mean that C and D are positively correlated for rate and pitch? What does that tell you about the behavior of this group of graduate students?
The rate must change whenever they talk to somebody who's high sexually.
Exactly. Central somehow, according to our weighted social network here. So the way that they speak, the rate and pitch change more for grad student I when they are speaking to someone that has high centrality. What would that mean? Are you surprised by that result?
It's kind of surprising. If I understand it correctly, I would assume that they would, while the pitch being higher makes sense if that's correlated with being like maybe nervous or something.
Okay.
But the turn length, it seems like you would speak less if you were talking to someone of like higher profile, because you would be like deferring to them.
Possibly. So the turn length here, I don't know if it explains it in the paper. I'm pretty sure it's turn length about I and J. So it could be that I is speaking for a short period of time, and then J, the central person, is hogging the floor. Hard to say in this case. The fact that pitch changes doesn't necessarily mean that pitch is higher or pitch is lower. It just means that pitch of I when they're speaking to J is more different compared to their average pitch when they talk to the other 22 graduate students, right? So then we can start to again try and explain this hypothesis and ask additional hypothesis questions like, is it the fact that I is somehow nervous or is aware that they're speaking to someone that's central and they're using more formal language, or they're deferring somehow to J? This work doesn't have anything to say about that, because again, we're throwing away everything here except just features of speech. But it is no longer an opinion or an idea. We have concrete data supporting the fact that humans are changing their behavior. It also tells us something else indirectly, that I must somehow know that J is central. Otherwise, I would not be changing their behavior when they speak to J compared to anyone else, right? Also kind of interesting. Okay, so this isn't a class on social science. We're not going to dig too much more into this experiment. But again, it's an interesting application of HCI where we're thinking carefully about the technology and we're thinking about physical context. If we want to infer a social network from conversations, we want to have a speaker near the speaker's mouth and their ear. And by doing it in that way, we can we can make it easier on a machine learning algorithm to infer that I is speaking or I is being spoken to by someone else in the group. If we have I and J and they're both wearing the microphone and I's volume is medium whenever J's volume is high, you can put that two pieces of information together and the machine learning algorithm predicts J is speaking to I or vice versa, or I is hearing speech but it's from someone outside the social group. Right? So lots of interesting information by thinking carefully about the physical context of face-to-face verbal communication. Thinking carefully also about social context here. Who is speaking with whom? Are they in the same classroom? Are they speaking mostly indoors and outdoors? Lots of interesting ideas here about how to apply ubiquitous computing. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about activity tagging. Like we've seen many times in HCI by now, this is going to be an interesting mixture of the subjective and the objective. Activity tagging started about 10 years ago, and I think this experiment that we're going to look at today is from 2011, so 8 years ago. Activity tagging and inference has come a long way since then. I don't see any Fitbits in the room, but I'm sure some of you are wearing some. Pretty ubiquitous technology now, kind of obvious. At the time, it was not so obvious. How do we go about instrumenting human wearers? Will they accept wearing something like a Fitbit? Assuming that they will, what can we measure about their behavior? What would they allow to be measured about their behavior? And given those objective measurements like speaker volume or other things that are easy to measure, how do we go about pushing those objective measurements through a machine learning algorithm to try and predict something increasingly subjective like well-being? Right? Difficult to say. What we're going to look at is this particular experiment today where they're going to take some of these correlates of well-being. As far as we know, it's very difficult to measure well-being directly. We're going to try and measure correlates of well-being and predict well-being as best we can. Before we do, however, let's think about physical and mental well-being. You can unpack that into some obvious aspects of behavior that are probably predictive of well-being. Are you getting too little or too much sleep? Are you getting too little exercise? How about intellectual stimulation, social interaction, diet? This one is still difficult to do. You can try and convince someone to take a photo of every meal they take, but it's not a very acceptable approach to measuring diet because, again, it's kind of onerous on the user, and stress as well. What are some other correlates of physical and mental well-being that we might try and create instrumentation to measure the correlates of it? So physical activity is kind of done, right? As long as you're wearing a Fitbit, that one's pretty straightforward. What are some of these more difficult correlates of well-being? What are some of these correlates of well-being that are a little bit more difficult to measure directly?
Another kind of aspect would be on phones, like the tracking what apps you're using.
Okay.
To see if you're using just which apps and how much of each one.
Absolutely, right? We could add screen time to this, which is definitely a correlate of well-being for many of us, and relatively easy to measure, right? It's already, by definition, on the phone. That one's an easy one to capture. It's a little bit more difficult. Intellectual stimulation, right? I'm hoping you're all intellectually stimulated this morning, but hard to say. And even if you were willing to be instrumented by myself, I'm not sure what I would measure to know whether you're being intellectually stimulated or not. Tricky. The quiz is my attempt to try and measure whether you were intellectually stimulated or not. Good point. How might you go about measuring stress? That's definitely a correlate of well-being.
Heart rate or perspiration.
Yep. Absolutely, right? So skin conductance is a good proxy for anxiety and stress. Heart rate, again, assuming you're wearing a Fitbit or something similar, you might be able to capture that. There are some attempts to create small sensors that you'd place on the inside of your mouth that would actually record what you're eating, so you don't need to take a picture of every meal. As you can imagine, the bar for acceptability of that kind of technology is pretty high, but for certain demographics that might be acceptable if diet is the particular challenge they face for well-being. Okay, so still an open problem, lots of interesting potential technology we could design and deploy in this case. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at what is now a bit of an older paper in this field, but one of the first attempts to try and measure some of these correlates of physical and well-being and use it to actually predict well-being. So they're going to start, we're going to see in a moment, they're going to directly measure several of the correlates of well-being. They're going to try and measure them as continuously and automatically as possible, right? Again, we want this to try and disappear into the background. We don't want to have the user's phone pinging them every 5 minutes and asking them what they're doing, how they're feeling, and so on. We'd like this to be as unobtrusive as possible. Once these raw measurements are taken, we have to try and create some sort of model that takes as input raw measurements and produces a number on the output, which is a rough measure of how well you're doing. So if, for example, we are measuring your amount of sleep over 3 different nights, and you're not getting enough sleep, this number should be low. If you're spending all day in bed for 3 days in a row, that number should also be low. If you're getting between 7 and 8 hours of sleep, this number should be high. That's what we're trying to aim for here. What form should that model take? And what machine learning algorithm might we use to try and train it? Finally, assuming that we can distill down all these raw measurements into a rough estimate of physical and psychological well-being, might be nice to show that to the user so they can try and modify their behavior accordingly. So these are the 3 tasks we're going to try and tackle in this case. So I assigned the actual research paper as today's reading. They got a nice pretty picture here of this basic idea. Just to reinforce this, we're going to try and measure things directly, use those raw measurements to model well-being, and then inform them and hope to promote well-being in this way. Okay, so let's have a look at some of this raw data. So again, looks a little dated maybe at this time. what are the sensors that are in play in this example here? Here are the raw measurements. What are collecting them?
Looks like a GPS with odometer.
GPS, so we've got exactly, so we have a map down here, so we're tracking their movement, maybe their motion, might tell us something about physical activity.
Microphone was the first role.
Exactly, a microphone. So the authors of this paper, the same authors of the paper we just looked at. So again, they're using a microphone, and they're going to try and use that microphone to infer something about social activity. Is the user hearing silence, noise? Are they speaking? Are they being spoken to? Or is it something else? They have an accelerometer, so they're measuring something about the movement of the user itself, but not just motion. They're trying to predict from particular motion patterns whether someone is stationary, walking, and running. So we're going to come at this from lots of different directions using different sensors and different raw measurements. Okay, let's tackle sleep first. Most of our phones today, there's a sensor that knows whether the battery is being charged or not. We've got a clock, accelerometer, digital compass, GPS, microphone, camera. If you're going to write a sleep app to try and predict the number of hours of sleep per day that the user is getting, how would you combine these sensors together to do so?
You would assume that the user uses their phone nonstop throughout the day, so after a certain period of time, if the phone hasn't been lifted, turned on, or taken out of standby mode, you would assume that they're asleep.
Okay, so whenever they're awake, they're using it, and if they're not using it, they're asleep. For some of us, that may be true, yes. Assuming some of us can exercise self-control throughout the day and are not using the phone, like this 75-minute period, hopefully none of you are asleep, so okay.
You might have the GPS location of your bed, so you know that they're at least in that vicinity, which is like 20 feet.
Okay, so if you have a desk in your bedroom, especially if you're a student, maybe you spend a lot of time there studying. So again, this might be helpful. You can sort of see where this is going, right? There's going to be no one combination that's perfect. So we want to try and combine together as many of these as possible. So acceleration, moving around, as the phone is moving, I'm probably awake unless I'm asleep on a train while it's moving or a bus. Again, maybe GPS is useful. They're in their bedroom. What other information we bring together to increase our prediction accuracy about sleep?
You use a microphone to measure ambient noise.
Okay, we could use the microphone if it's quiet. That's probably helpful.
Let's use a sensor to measure BPM.
BPM, right? So heart rate. Again, assuming someone is willing to wear something while they're sleeping. So again, we're getting into physical context. Some people would say yes. Some people would not find that acceptable. We might have to find different subsets of sensors for different users. What else?
Actually, Nap is suggested me to put the phone beside me when I was asleep, and he can measure my.
Okay. If you're a snorer, that makes
Yeah.
it easier. Then maybe we'll use the
Yeah,
microphone
that's
as well.
An example.
Depends, right? So any one of these measurements is not going to be very accurate, but combining them together might be the case, right? I don't know about you, but I usually plug my phone in at night when I go to sleep. So if it's plugged in, that's a good sign. If it's quiet, that's a good sign. If I'm in my bedroom, that's a good sign. Even for something like sleep, it's a little bit tricky. Okay. So you can read the paper. They used a similar combination to what we just described. And according to the authors, the results show that a simple model, and we'll look at the model in a moment, that combines phone recharging, lack of movement, and lack of ambient noise is sufficient to predict the amount of hours slept, plus or minus 90 minutes. Not great. I know Fitbits are much better at this now. They detect sleep and also whether you're moving during sleep, so you get a much more accurate reading. But this was sort of state of the art 8 years ago. Okay, what's the model? So again, the model is sort of visualized on the right here, not that surprising. So too much sleep, or if you're spending too much time in bed, that's not really a great thing. Not enough sleep, obviously, also not a good thing. So they're defining here something called HR sub-ideal, which according to the researchers and the sleep literature at that time, 7 hours on average for most people was a good amount of sleep. Obviously, there's a lot of standard deviation. Some people need less, some people need more. They also derived upper and lower limits, again from the sleep literature. If you're getting 8 or 9 or 10 hours, that's not so great. Obviously, there's a lower limit as well. They're going to take HR sub actual, the actual amount of sleep over a 24-hour period here. And we're going to push this through a simple mathematical model which has an exponent here. And the exponent leads to exponential increase. And we won't go through the math here, but it basically produces this curve here. So if we plug in HR sub actual, and actual is probably not a good term because we don't know the actual amount of sleep the user is getting. Actual should actually say predicted. So we're getting actual from the raw measurements on the phone. It's predicting how many hours of sleep you got last night, pushing that through this equation, which gives you back the number sleep sub day, which is how your sleep is positively or negatively contributing to your well-being. So if you're getting very little sleep, sleep sub day is 0. If you're spending 9, 10, 12, 14 hours in bed, you're getting a value of sleep sub day also of 0. So we're trying to maximize this value, which is not the amount of sleep, it's the amount that sleep is contributing to your positive physical well-being. Okay. Again, you can see how we're moving from the objective to the subjective here. Okay. That's sleep. Let's tackle physical activity now. And again, there's lots of technologies out here that are doing this very well. Assuming we have an accelerometer or some sort of motion data, we can pretty accurately predict whether someone is in motion or they're in a vehicle which is in motion. So again, already tricky. Can we drill down even further and use motion data to predict which physical activity the user is engaged in? The authors of this paper, when they were writing this paper about 9 years ago, I visited them in Dartmouth, and the investigator brought up an app on his phone, and he could see exactly where his graduate students were on campus. This one was biking towards the lab. This one was walking across campus. I'm assuming the graduate students knew that he had this app, but who knows? Who knows? Okay, so let's play the same game. We want to infer not just that the user is in motion, but can we infer which activity they're engaged in given phone data?
You could at least specify running. You could see if they're moving up or down, whereas a car you usually be pretty flat, or a bicycle. And as far as swimming, if the phone doesn't turn on anymore, they're probably swimming.
Possibly. Most of us don't swim with our phones. Are they sleeping or swimming? Whatever they're doing, they're not using the phone at the moment. So obviously, some of these activities are going to be more difficult than others. It depends, again, on the physical context of the particular activity. But as you mentioned, we can use change in the acceleration data. We can look for regular patterns of motion that will allow us to distinguish between walking and running, moving oneself, or being moved by another vehicle. Right? Okay, so let's focus in on walking and running for a moment. This is the one we're going to try and capture. We're going to try and use accelerometer data here. We're going to start by measuring a subject's actual exertion. So while a given subject is actually walking or running, how much energy are they actually using? We're going to measure that first. And then we're eventually going to train a machine learning algorithm to predict that exertion. We really don't want to know whether someone is walking or running. Assuming that this is about physical activity, we're trying to predict how many calories they're burning. We're going to get actual exertion. Then we're going to get raw acceleration data. We're going to, again, create a model that's going to take as input this acceleration data and produce as output a prediction about calories burned. And we are then going to try and use machine learning as usual to try and minimize prediction error of the model. So the model outputs exertion predicted, and we have exertion actual, and we're going to train the model to minimize that. So we can go eventually, assuming we've trained this model and assuming that the user is wearing their phone while they're walking or running, the phone can make a relatively accurate prediction about how many calories are being burned at a given point in time. Okay, how do we measure actual exertion? Luckily, we don't all have to do this. In this case, the authors relied on VO2 max, or change in volume of oxygen while performing a physical activity. You can see this in action here. So when we're at rest, or especially when we're exerting physical effort, we're obviously taking in oxygen, burning the oxygen, and releasing carbon dioxide. So assuming that you can measure that intake and outtake, you can look at the difference of oxygen coming in and oxygen going out. The more you're exercising, the more you're exerting, the more oxygen you're burning for a same time interval. So that's what they actually measured, and now we're going to try and predict this. How might we go about predicting this? First thing that might be useful for the model is resting metabolic rate. If you're a highly trained athlete, for the same activity, you're burning less oxygen than someone who is not used to that particular activity. We're then also going to use acceleration data. We're going to try and break this down into the horizontal and vertical component of acceleration. By doing so, we might be able to infer the activity a little bit better. Let's start with horizontal motion. Okay, so the phone is on, the accelerometer is detecting, and the accelerometer is detecting that there is a regular change in acceleration, which I'm showing here. We can think of this as leg movement if you want. Assuming somebody's wearing this in their pocket, this might actually be on their thigh, and they might actually get a good measurement of leg movement.
I have a different question. Not quite
Sure.
sure how exactly I want to ask it, but so we were talking about the sleeping and having a phone app do measuring your sleeping, but only
It's not measuring sleep, it's going to try and predict sleep from its
sure.
sensors.
It could be more accurate if they wore a peripheral like a band or a Fitbit or whatever, but you were saying if they wanted to.
If they wanted to.
At what point do you, as an HCI designer, say, okay, like swimming, for example, again, we could do it, but it's going to be so hard, they can either accept this or they're just not going to get it. Is there a cutoff point that's pretty consistent that it's like, well, X work means too bad?
Exactly. So we could say to our users, if you don't accept this technology, then there's no way we can infer your swimming, for example, and that's perfectly fine. Another company comes along and says, we can do it. We can infer from a distance. We've created a phone app that uses microphone data, does some very sophisticated machine learning, and can detect the sound of somebody swimming as long as the phone is within 50 feet of the swimming pool, right? So of course you can decide not to try and predict it. The goal in ubiquitous technology is it should disappear into the background. I go for a swim and I leave my phone by the side of the pool. Is there a way, if we think carefully about the physical and cultural and social context of going for a swim, where you might be able to indirectly infer that activity? Might be difficult, but if you can do it, then you've got an advantage over someone who says you either accept a wearable or you don't.
But once you start talking about sound or anything along those lines, aren't you instantly in privacy?
Absolutely. So there's another acceptability issue, which is you need to turn on your microphone and leave it on. Maybe that is not acceptable. Right? Absolutely. A lot of these practical considerations. Okay, so back to our exercising user here. They've got their accelerometer on, and the accelerometer is detecting the fact that there is a regular motion, possibly leg motion if the phone is actually near on their legs. That's fine. Pretty straightforward. You can then, assuming that there is regular motion, you can apply some additional mathematical methods from signal processing to tell you something about the frequency and other features of this repeating pattern. Not surprisingly, the faster your legs are swinging back and forth, the more you're exerting, right? So it's pretty straightforward to imagine a model that's able to find a relationship from frequency to exertion for the horizontal component, moving back and forth. What about the vertical component? So imagine I'm walking at a certain frequency. I'm walking on flat ground, or I'm walking up a very steep hill, or I'm walking up 4 flights of stairs in the innovation building. Same frequency, but now the vertical component is different. I've got my phone, I've got my accelerometer data, I've got other sensors on the phone. How do you infer the vertical component of motion? It's going to be important if we want to try and predict exertion or calories burned.
The more, acceleration either direction, the steeper the incline.
More acceleration in either direction. Which two
When I
directions?
say positive or negative y.
Exactly. So assuming we get acceleration data on 3 dimensions, left and right, forward and back, up and down, as long as if I know I've got up and down, then it's easy, right? If there's more acceleration up than there is down, I'm going up. Think very carefully about this physical context. If I get more positive y than negative y, can the phone confidently predict that the user is walking uphill or going upstairs? Think about the accelerometer itself in the phone.
I don't know. I think the accelerometer has a way to normalize himself, so the positive y is always.
The positive y is always up, right? So older phones, this might be positive y, but this is now negative y, right? It depends on how you put your phone in your pocket. These days, again, maybe it doesn't matter so much, right? And this particular example doesn't matter too much, but yet another example, we need to think very carefully about this problem. There was an interesting discussion, I can't remember if it was in this paper or not, about using a barometer, which actually does exist on some phones. There are very slight decreases in air pressure as obviously you move up. If you're climbing a mountain, then absolutely the barometer is going to be useful here. Climbing a flight of stairs indoors, air pressure is probably not going to be very useful. So as suggested, the usual way to do this is still just rely on accelerometer data, but we look for asymmetries in the repeating pattern, right? If there is more time spent in positive y than negative y, or vice versa, we can detect moving up and down which direction the user is moving in, right? Getting into some very detailed analysis of the acceleration data. Okay, so we now assume that we've got our accelerometer data. We've got our model that takes accelerometer data as input and produces a prediction given the horizontal and vertical components of the motion itself. We assume that we have some VO2 max information, so we know the actual exertion of our user, and we're going to train our model to minimize its prediction error against actual exertion. Okay. Again, in this paper, they used a very, very simple model, not unlike what we just saw for sleep. They're going to take a metabolic actual aerobic activity per day. And again, this is a little bit misleading. This should not be actual. This is the predicted activity from the accelerometer data. We're going to take high and low, maximum and minimum recommended total aerobic activity per day. In this case, they weren't measuring the actual calories burned per day. They were just asking, was the number of calories burned per unit time above some threshold for how many minutes per week? So you're exercising or you're not. They kept it pretty low resolution, and they pushed it through another model here which normalizes to give you physical subday. So again, physical subday is going to be near zero if you're not exercising enough, or in this case, if you spend all your time in the gym. And it's going to give you a high value if you're spending somewhere between 150 and 300 minutes per day, per week exercising. Again, there's a lot of hand waving here. This is very subjective, but we're trying to go from raw accelerometer data to giving the user a simple number. You didn't spend enough time exercising this week, or you spent perhaps too much time. Okay. Okay, social interaction. This one is not that different from what we saw in the previous experiment. They're again going to go now from microphone volume to infer whether you're in conversation with someone or not. And somewhat controversial, they're going to use conversation as social interaction. You can obviously engage in a meaningful social interaction with someone without actually speaking to them. We're going to ignore that for now. We're going to play the same trick here. We're going to try and take, where is it here? Duration actual. So predicted duration of conversation relative to total time that the microphone is active. So how much time is the microphone detecting that you are speaking or listening to someone else versus not? And give you back social per day. How many hours or how many minutes per day? I'm sorry, whether you're spending enough time in conversations or not. I don't know what enough time is. Again, lots of hand waving here.
What if you have animals and you like talking to them a lot?
If you're talking to your pets, does that count or not? Definitely meaningful, definitely meaningful. Okay. Okay. So here's some actual data from some of the alpha testers of this technology. So we've got Monday to Sunday on the horizontal axis here, and the vertical axis, again, is not the total amount of physical exercise, social interaction, or hours of sleep. It's whether these three components of well-being are being maximized or minimized throughout the week. Assuming that we can trust these predicted values, what does this tell us about this particular user? If anything.
I have a very busy weekend.
A very busy weekend.
Lots of activity, less sleep.
That makes sense. Okay. Okay, and then they put this together in a very nice app and used some fancy graphics here to give sort of a dashboard view for the user. I think the turtle is sleep and the fish school is exercise and the starfish. Oh no, it's the school of fish, which is social interaction, makes sense. And I don't know whether a starfish is active or not. Take your pick here. But again, the idea, trying to take all this raw data and boil it down into something that's intuitive or engaging or entertaining, to at least give a rough estimate to the users about how well they're doing from one week to the next. How many of you would download this app onto your phone?
Not today.
Not today, not today. Maybe 2011, possibly. Okay, obviously this has turned into a huge industry, right? There are a lot of people that are very curious about data analytics for predicting physical, social, and emotional well-being. As you can see, it's fraught with a lot of challenges. Can you infer various activities? Can you make good predictions about sleep, activity, diet, stress, and so on? If you can, does it require wearable technology? How invasive does it need to be? And is it going to be acceptable to the user? Are they going to accept wearing a device or accept privacy issues by leaving the phone and the accelerometer data on most of the time? Depends. Okay. Okay, so just as a summary here, in this early example, they were trying to infer sleep, physical activity, and social interaction. Phone plugged in, is not moving and it's quiet. Predict sleep. Infer the amount of energy spent from accelerometer data. infer something about social interaction from picking up voices. You could imagine a lot of difficulties with these technologies. You can imagine bringing in lots of other sensors to corroborate and improve these predictions if the user is willing to do so. Okay, so let's move on. We're a little bit ahead of schedule here. I haven't put up the link for today's lecture. I'll do that when I get back to my office. We're going to look now at the Human Speechome Project. So we looked at inferring something about social behavior among a group of graduate students. We just looked at inferring something about social and physical well-being for an individual wearer. We're now going to look at a completely different domain, which is how do children go about acquiring language? What causes a child to emit a particular word for the first time in a particular setting? This is a subject that's been studied in developmental psychology for decades and decades. It is an extremely difficult question to answer. Language acquisition is still a very mysterious process. Could we deploy ubiquitous technology to try and measure and understand what's going on during the first few years of a child's development and use that data to predict when, where, and why they will utter a certain word for the first time? You can imagine why I chose this particular experiment. This is particularly difficult. There is particular social context, physical context, cultural context surrounding the early years of human children. How do we go about doing this? Okay, so we're going to look at this third experiment now where we're going to try and deploy some technology to be as unobtrusive as possible. However, we want to try and collect enough data to try and answer or explore this question of how children acquire language. We're going to look at, again, now a somewhat dated experiment from 10 years ago. The questions tackled in this particular paper: how do children learn language? And now drilling down into that, what aspects of their physical and social environment trigger language acquisition? A young child may emit a particular word for the first time, but they may have heard that word 2 days earlier. How do we know that they heard that word, and how do we know that hearing that word influenced them emitting it on that particular day? What events in the past influence the learning and utterance of new words? Okay. So, what's the typical approach to doing this? The typical approach is to invite into the laboratory young children and their parents or caregivers, and then give the caregiver, the parent, a very careful script to follow, and then watch what happens. So, in this case, as you can see in the little cartoon here, little picture, the parent is looking at a particular object, and let's assume they're repeatedly pronouncing the name of that object, blue block, blue block, blue block, while they're looking at the object. And the investigators observe that the child looks at the parent's eyes and infers that the parent is looking at something else, follows the gaze of the parent to the blue block. And so now both parent and child are jointly attending to the same object. This is a phenomenon known as joint attention. We do this all the time. Most of you, when I did this, you looked over at the slides, because although I'm not looking at the slide, I'm giving a signal that I want you to attend to this object. As the child follows the parent's gaze to the blue block, at the same time the child hears the word blue block. So perhaps we can derive the hypothesis that children acquire language, assuming the child then said blue block. We could infer, or we could treat this observation as evidence supporting the hypothesis that children acquire language through joint attention. If a parent is directing a child's attention to an object while saying the name of that object, and then the child says that object as well, that seems to suggest that hypothesis, right? Seems to make sense. But we gave the parent the script to do this. What if we gave the parent the script to do something else and found that that also triggered the child to say the word blue block? The investigator is wrapped up in the hypothesis and the experiment themselves. Can we instrument some technology to try and take the investigator out of the experiment? This is an ongoing revolution in psychology. Most psychological experiments are what's known as being theory-laden. We start with the theory. I theorize that children learn language through joint attention. So I'm going to use that hypothesis to set up an experiment and test it. It's okay. But instead of being theory-laden, it would be nice to be data-driven instead, is to step out and just collect information about parents and children in their natural habitat and look at that raw data for patterns, right? So the investigator is no longer involved and is no longer influencing the interaction between parent and child. All we could really say, if in fact the child does say blue block more often with the parent in this example, is children tend to say blue block when they're in a laboratory setting with white walls and scary people around, and the parent who's somehow acting a little bit strange because they're following a script. That triggered the utterance of blue block in this case. We can't with confidence generalize from this laboratory setting to say children in general acquire language because they jointly attend to what their parents are attending to. Okay, so instead of the typical approach of doing this in a laboratory, we're going to look at an experiment from Professor Roy here, where he and his wife observed their child continuously for the first 3 years of their child's life in its own environment, their home. It's a longitudinal study. They're studying the child over a long period of time. As you can imagine, this is an extremely controversial experiment. The scientist is studying his own child, so this qualifies as human subject research. In the United States, legally, whenever you conduct scientific experiments that involve human subjects, they have to give their written permission that they're involved in the experiment. We're dealing with children who cannot legally agree to anything, so who agrees on their behalf?
The parent.
The parent, who in this case is also the investigator, right? Huge conflict of interest, very controversial. If you're not happy with that, you're welcome to leave class early this morning. No takers? Okay. All right, keep that in the back of your mind. Obviously, this is somewhat controversial. Let's see what Professor Roy and his wife learned from this experiment. I'm going to play part of the TED Talk about that Deb gave on the results of this experiment after the fact.
Imagine if you could record your life. Everything you said, everything you did, available in a perfect memory store at your fingertips. So you could go back and find memorable moments and relive them, or sift through traces of time and discover patterns in your own life that previously had gone undiscovered. Well, that's exactly the journey that my family began 5.5 years ago. This is my wife and collaborator, Rupal, and on this day, at this moment, we walked into the house with our first child, our beautiful baby boy. And we walked into a house with a very special home video recording system.
Okay.
This moment and thousands of other moments special for us were captured in our home because in every room in the house, if you looked up, you'd see a camera and a
Can you guys hear in the back? Yeah? Okay.
microphone. And if you look down, you get this bird's eye view of the room. Here's our living room, the baby bedroom, kitchen, dining room, and the rest of the house. And all of these fed into a disk array that was designed for continuous capture. So here we are flying through a day in our home as we move from sunlit morning through incandescent evening, and finally lights out for the day. Over the course of 3 years, we recorded 8 to 10 hours a day, amassing roughly 250,000 hours of multi-track audio and video. So you're looking at a piece of what is by far the largest home video collection ever made. I think that's clear. And what this data represents for our family at a personal level, the impact has already been immense, and we're still learning its value. Countless moments of unsolicited, natural moments, not posed moments, are captured there, and we're starting to learn how to discover them and find them. But there's also a scientific reason that drove this project, which was to use this kind of natural longitudinal data to understand the process of how a child learns language, that child being my son. And so, with many privacy provisions put in place to protect everyone who's recorded in the data, we made elements of the data available to my trusted research team at MIT so we could start teasing apart patterns in this massive data set, trying to understand the influence of social environments on language acquisition. So we're looking here at one of the first things we started to do. This is my wife and I cooking breakfast in the kitchen. And as we move through space and through time, a very everyday pattern of life in the kitchen, in order to convert this opaque 90,000 hours of video into something we can start to see, we use motion analysis to pull out, as we move through space and through time, what we call space-time worms. And this has become a part of our toolkit for being able to look and see where the activities are in the data, and with it, trace the patterns of, in particular, where my son moved throughout the home, so that we could focus our transcription efforts, all the speech environment around my son, all the words that he heard from myself, my wife, our nanny, and over time, the words he began to produce. So with that technology and that data and the ability to, with machine assistance, transcribe speech, we've now transcribed well over 7 million words of our home transcripts. And with that, let me take you now for a first tour into the data. So you've all, I'm sure, seen time-lapse videos where a flower will blossom as you accelerate time. I'd like you to now experience the blossoming of a speech form. My son, soon after his first birthday, would say gaga to mean water. And over the course of the next half year, he slowly learned to approximate the proper adult form, water. So we're going to cruise through half a year in about 40 seconds. No video here, so you can focus on the sound, the acoustics of a new kind of trajectory. Gaga to water. He sure nailed it, didn't he? So he didn't just learn water. Over the course of the 24 months, the first 2 years that we really focused on, this is a map of every word he learned in chronological order. And because we have full transcripts, we've identified each of the 503 words that he learned to produce by his second birthday. He was an early talker. And so we started to analyze why. Why were certain words born before others? This is one of the first results that came out of our study a little over a year ago that really surprised us. The way to interpret this apparently simple graph is on the vertical is an indication of how complex caregiver utterances are based on the length of utterances. And the vertical axis is time. And all of the data we aligned based on the following idea. Every time my son would learn a word, we would trace back and look at all of the language he heard that contained that word, and we would plot the relative length of the utterances. And what we found was this curious phenomena that caregiver speech would systematically dip to a minimum, making language as simple as possible. and then slowly ascend back up in complexity. And the amazing thing was that that bounce, that dip, lined up almost precisely with when each word was born. Word after word, systematically. So
I want to just pause there for a moment. So this idea that the length of the utterances before the child ever said the word was long. So, do you want a glass of water? Would you like some water? And as the time approached at which the child uttered the word for the first time, water, the length of the utterances of the parents in the home was getting shorter and shorter. Would you like some water? How about some water? Water, water, shorter. Then the child says it. And then after the child utters the word water for the first time, in the months that follow, parents start to lengthen the length of the utterances that contain the word water.
Question.
Yep.
Is it sort of like taking down or building up scaffolding first and then taking it down, just like in a U-shape?
Exactly. You stole my question. This is a great example of scaffolding, right? This is exactly it. It's a dip, but the way to think about it is they're adding scaffolding, and then when the child utters the word water, they gradually remove it again. I mentioned last time that scaffolding is an idea that came from developmental psychology. It's known that parents do this. It wasn't known until this experiment that they were doing it in this way with language forms.
So wouldn't this be sort of obviously not conscious over a long period of time, just because humans don't really pay attention to that degree? But wouldn't it just be like you hear a child trying to say particular words, and so you start to focus on those words because you know when they say gaga or something, they're looking for water. So you say, oh, do you want water? And you just repeat water over and over because you know that that's what they're trying to say, and then eventually they get it, and so you can start building up the rest of the sentence on top of it.
So that's a perfectly valid hypothesis. We can now ask questions for why this phenomenon exists. It's difficult to imagine that parents are conscious of this process for all the words. Perhaps there's a simple heuristic at work here, which is the parents are inferring that the child is getting close to emitting the adult form of the word, and that triggers scaffolding in the parents. That may or may not be true. We could imagine if we had access to Professor Roy's data, that we could go back into the data and look for additional information to prove or disprove that hypothesis. If you remember back when we were having our discussion about visual design, one of the great aspects of visual design is being able to actively interrogate a data set, right? We see a new phenomenon for the first time, this verbal scaffolding for word birth, which generates a hypothesis for why it's occurring. How could we dive back into the data to find evidence for or against that hypothesis?
Another question is, because this is only one child.
One child.
We observe only one child. There may be some other possibilities. So I learned that if we want to establish a causation, we need to do experiment. So this is observational.
This is purely observational.
Yeah, so it cannot establish the causation.
It doesn't tell us anything about causal mechanism, right? There was a proposal here for causal mechanism. Parents are aware of what's happening, and that causes word birth, causes them to reduce the length of their utterances, which in turn causes children to utter the adult form for the first time. This data can tell us nothing about causation, but we can investigate, go back into the data and find additional correlations and sort of marshal them around our hypothesized causal mechanism. But ultimately, if we want to try and prove causation, we need to go back to experiment. Yep, good point.
That's more controversial.
Much more controversial. Okay, let's carry on.
It appears that all three primary caregivers, myself, my wife, and our nanny, were systematically, and I would think subconsciously, restructuring our language to meet him at the moment of the birth of a word and bring him gently into more complex language. And the implications of this, there are many, but one I just want to point out is that there must be amazing feedback loops. It's not, of course, my son is learning from his linguistic environment, but the environment is learning from him. That environment, people, are in these tight feedback loops and creating a kind of scaffolding that has not been noticed until now. But that's looking at the speech context. What about the visual context? We're now looking at, think of this as a dollhouse cutaway of our house. We've taken those circular fisheye lens cameras and we've done some optical correction, and then we can bring it into three-dimensional life. So welcome to my home. This is a moment, one moment captured across multiple cameras. The reason we did this is to create the ultimate memory machine where you can go back and interactively fly around and then breathe video life into this system. What I'm going to do is give you an accelerated view of 30 minutes, again, of just life in the living room. That's me and my son on the floor. And there's video analytics that are tracking our movements. My son is leaving red ink, I'm leaving green ink. We're now on the couch looking out through the window at cars passing by, and finally my son playing in a walking toy by himself. Now we freeze the action, 30 minutes. We turn time into the vertical axis, and we open up for a view of these interaction traces we've just left behind. And we see these amazing structures. These little knots of two colors of thread we call social hotspots. The spiral thread we call a solo hotspot. And we think that these affect the way language is learned. What we'd like to do is start understanding the interaction between these patterns and the language that my son is exposed to see if we can predict how the structure of when words are heard affects when they're learned. So in other words, the relationship between words and what they're about in the world. So here's how we're approaching this. In this video, again, my son is being traced out. He's leaving red ink behind, and there's our nanny by the door.
You want water? All right.
She offers water, and off go the two worms over to the kitchen to get water. And what we've done is use the word water to tag that moment, that bit of activity. And now we take the power of data and take every time my son ever heard the word water and the context he saw it in, and we use it to penetrate through the video and find every activity trace that co-occurred with the instance of water. And what this data leaves in its wake is a landscape. We call these wordscapes. This is the wordscape for the word water. And you can see most of the action is in the kitchen. That's where those big peaks are over to the left. And just for contrast, we can do this with any word. We can take the word bye, as in goodbye, and we're now zoomed in over the entrance to the house, and we look and we find, as you'd expect, a contrast in the landscape where the word bye occurs much more in a structured way. So we're using these structures to start predicting the order of language acquisition, and that's sort of ongoing work now. In my lab, which we're peering into now at MIT, this is at the Media Lab, this has become my favorite way of videographing just about any space. Three of the key people in this project, Philip DeCamp, Ronnie Kubat, and Brandon Roy are pictured here. Philip has been a close collaborator on all the visualizations you're seeing. And Michael Fleischman was another PhD student in my lab who worked with me on this home video analysis. And he made the following observation, that just the way that we're analyzing how language connects to events which provide common ground for language, that same idea we can take out of your home, Deb, and we can apply it to the world of public media. And so our effort took an unexpected turn. Think of mass media as providing common ground. And you have the recipe for taking this idea to a whole new place. We've started analyzing television content using the same principles, analyzing event structure of a TV signal, episodes of shows, commercials, all of the components that make up the event structure. And we're now, with satellite dishes, pulling in and analyzing a good part of all the TV being watched in the United States. And you don't have to now go and instrument living rooms with microphones to get people's conversations. You just tune into publicly available social media feeds. So we're pulling in about 3 billion comments a month. And then the magic happens. You have the event structure, the common ground that the words are about coming out of the television feeds. You've got the conversations that are about those topics. And through semantic analysis, and this is actually real data you're looking at from our data, our processing, each yellow line is showing a link being made between a comment in the wild and a piece of event structure coming out of the television signal. And the same idea now can be built up, and we get this wordscape, except now words are not assembled in my living room. Instead, the context, the common ground, the activities are the content on television that's driving the conversations. And so what we're seeing here, these skyscrapers now, are commentary that are linked to content on television. Same concept, but looking at communication dynamics in a very different sphere. So fundamentally, rather than, for example, measuring content based on how many people are watching, this gives us the basic data for looking at engagement properties of content. And just like we can look at feedback cycles and dynamics in a family, we can now open up the same concepts and look at much larger groups of people. This is a subset of data from our database, just 50,000 out of several million, and the social graph that connects them through publicly available sources. And if you put them on one plane, a second plane is where the content lives. So we have the programs and the sporting events and the commercials and all of the link structures that tie them together make a content graph. And then the important third dimension. Each of the links that you're seeing rendered here is an actual connection made between something someone said and a piece of content. And there are, again, now tens of millions of these links that give us the connective tissue of social graphs and how they relate to content. And we can now start to probe the structure in interesting ways. So if we, for example, trace the path of one piece of content that drives someone to comment on it, and then we follow where that comment goes and look at the entire social graph that becomes activated, and then trace back to see the relationship between that social graph and content, very interesting structure becomes visible. We call this a co-viewing clique, a virtual living room, if you will. And there are fascinating dynamics at play. It's not one way. A piece of content, an event, causes someone to talk. They talk to other people. That drives tune-in behavior back into mass media. And you have these cycles that drive the overall behavior. Another example, very different, another actual person in our database, and we're finding at least hundreds, if not thousands of these. We've given this person a name. This is a pro-amateur or pro-am media critic who has this high fan-out rate. I
think we'll pause the video there. Before you go, just a quick note about this video. Obviously, there's two phases here. One of the students from last year summarized these two phases as phase one is Big Daddy and phase two is Big Brother. So this harkens back to the good old days when clearly this was a good thing to measure everyone's behavior, what they were watching, and so on. Very different today. We'll talk about the implications of this next time. You have a quiz due tonight, and you're working on deliverable 9. See you next Tuesday. Thank you.